Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back to me, I guess. Good to be back. Let's pick up where we left off. We're on Masechet Beitza. Um, we're on Daf Chaf
Vav.
Vav at the top. Right. Well, really at the
At the
bottom.
bottom.
At the bottom. Right. We're on that. We got up to Chaf Vav Amud Aleph. Okay. Let's just go through it very, very quickly because we're going to see. We are continuing on this discussion regarding a Bechor and regarding checking the Bechor for Mumim on Yom Tov. Right, we saw Machloket in the Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Let's just see very quickly the Gemara again that we saw last time. We saw the Gemara says, from the top in the third line, said, what was the Machloket over there between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon? Was it Inema Broin Mumin Kamiflegay? Are we going to say the Machloket? The Gemara is going to discuss this more later on. But are we going to say the machloket is about seeing a mum? Remember, if the animal has a mum, the bechor, so you need to go to a mumche to determine whether that is a mum kavua or mum over. It's going to be very, very, very different relating those two. If it's a mum kavua, so then it goes out to cholin. If it's a mum over, you have to wait, and you have to still bring it as a korban, the Beit Hamikdash. By the way, we're a few months away still. But when we get to Elul and when we get to the time of Slichot, so everybody knows we say Slichot for at least Ashkenazim for at least 4 days, right? The Sfardim amongst us would already have a whole month. But Ashkenazim, the minhag is we always say Slichot for at least 4 days. We always start on a Motzei Shabbos, but it's at least 4 days. And why do we have 4 days? So it's brought different reasons brought in the poskim, but one of them is that it's similar to a korban. On all the other Yamim Tovim, it says Vikravtim Olah, but by Rosh Hashanah it says Vasitim Olah. In other words, we Kiviyachol bring ourselves, offer ourselves as a korban to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and right allusions to the Akedah and all sorts of things. And a korban you have to check for a mum for 4 days. Here we're talking about a bechor, it's a slightly different case, but the same thing. When you have a korban, it can't have a mum. You have to check it for 4 days beforehand to know. That's why we learn from Korban Pesach. They're tied to the doorpost for 4 days, etc. So we have to check ourselves, so to speak, for 4 days. So I asked the question, heard once, which was, and what do we do if we find a mum? Right? There's nothing you can do. So the answer is that you have a mum kavua and you have a mum over, meaning a Jew. If we have something wrong with us, we have something that we're not quite getting right, that's a mum over. It's never a mum kavua. Every now and then it comes and goes, and we have to know how to fix it, and we have to make it pass. But that is it's a little homiletical idea, relating the idea of mum. In any event, so says the Gemara here, we say, "B'may kamiflegay, nema baroin mumin kamiflegay, Rabbi Yehuda savar in mumin b'yom tov, Rabbi Shimon savar in mumin b'yom tov." Right. So let's say that the machloket between them was whether you're allowed to go, whether Mumcha is allowed to go and see the Mum on Yom Tov, right? So then the Gemara said, meaning, if that's the case, it was just a stam machloket about whether you can see the Mum on Yom Tov or not, so that should be a case anytime whether you can see a Mum on Yom Tov. What's that got to do with the fact that it fell into a bore? Right? That seems irrelevant. So the Gemara, no, it is relevant. You need it because okay, that was the point. We would have thought that if you just taught me that there's a machloket ba'alma between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about seeing mumim on Yom Tov, so I would have thought, okay, even for the one who says no, you can't, but if an animal falls into a bore, okay, so now we have an issue of Tzar Balei Chayim, so therefore we would have thought that a certain amount of harama is going to be permitted. Right? Would have said, meaning let's go and take the animal out the pit, and then when it's out, you can check it. Okay, but you can do that harama to say, oh, we'll take it out because it must have a mum, and then obviously can have a mum in order that to avoid the tzar balei chayim. But we're saying no, we can't do that. Anyway, that would be like the pin of Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua, Kamash Malan, comes to teach you that is in fact not the case, and that is why we don't have the machloket in such a scenario. So say Ihachi lo yishchot. If that's the case, it should say, why does it say lo yishchot. That was the language of the Mishnah. It should say lo yalev yishchot min ba'alei. It should say don't take the animal up and shecht it. Lo yishchot makes it sound like you can't shecht it, but it doesn't mean necessarily you can't go and take it out of the pit. So lo yalev yishchot min ba'alei. So the answer is lo tzricha da'avad ve'iske, meaning da'avar ve'iske. Excuse me. That we're talking about a case where even where somebody went and did this harama, even though they weren't allowed to, so nonetheless you're still going to, because you might have said sagadat achamina lishachti. You might have said, okay, you weren't meant to go and take it, but now you've taken it out, and if the mumcha comes and sees a mum, you can still shecht it, or maybe not. Maybe since you've taken it out, you can still shecht it. Kamash malan. That's not the case. So here the Gemara asked the question and said, wait, none of this actually makes sense. What kind of avamina is that? How are you going to be able to shech? We're dealing with a bechor, just to be kodesh, right? So we said l'shechte hatamu. We're dealing with a case where there is no mum. So lo tzricha denafal be'muma. You must be talking about a case where, in fact, it does have a mum, ve'amuktzau, and therefore it's muktzah. Ela denafal be'mum over me'elev yom tov. But it had a mum over, and a passing mum on erev yom tov. Now it has a mum kavua. You might have thought that since beforehand there was a mum and I wasn't sure if it was a mum kavua, therefore it wasn't any more muktzah, and I had in mind to shecht it. So kamash malan that is not the case. Rashi here says kamash malan. Okay, Rashi a few lines down. He says the lo hava kavua me'erev Yom Tov. Since there was no mum kavua from before Yom Tov, lo yishchot mishum de muktzeh mechmat isul hava, because it's still going to be muktzeh because it's an isul to go and just shecht because there was no mum kavua. Inami mishum de avar va'aske. Alternatively, because of the fact that it's not actually muktzeh, but because it's I guess a knas, which we'll see now in more detail, that you went and you took it out. All right, that's more or less what we discussed last time. That was based on machloket about the bechor shenafal lebo, which is the machloket we saw in the Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. We now pick up from the two dots. Okay, we're now 6 lines from the bottom of the page. Right, we have 2 dots. It says Tana Rabbanan. Now we have a Braita dealing with a similar topic, not exactly the same, but a similar topic. The Braita says as follows: Tana Rabbanan, bechor tam שנפל לבור, רבי יהודה הנשיא אומר, ירד מומחה ויראה. Okay, we have a bechor, so interesting, we're going to have different girsaot here, because this is going to raise, obviously, an issue. If the Braita is talking about a bechor tam means there is no mum at all. So it says, bechor tam shenafal lebor, which fell into a pit. Rabbi Yehuda הנשיא אומר, ירד מומחה ויראה אם יש בו מום, יעלה וישחוט, ואם לאו, לא ישחוט. So Rabbi Yehuda הנשיא says that the mumcha can go down into the pit and he can see if it's got a mum, then you can bring it up and shecht it, and if it doesn't, then you cannot shecht it. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda hanasi is not the same as Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai. Rashi points that out. Let's see Rashi so far. Okay, well, the Braita is going to continue. It's going to get a little bit complicated, but let's see. So Rashi says here, b'chor tam shenafal lebor, galsinan bebraita. So this is Rashi's girsa. He also has it. It says b'chor tam. Deleit lo muktzeh lahanach tanai b'b'chor. He says, according to these, we now have a Braita. We're going to have a 3-way machloket amongst the Tanaim. But says Rashi, for these Tanaim, don't worry about muktzeh. They don't hold by muktzeh over here. Because they assume that even though the Bechor did not have a mum before Yom Tov, at any moment it could get a mum, and therefore we don't consider it to be muktzeh. So he says, Yared mumche, v'lo la'alim v'laske. Don't do haraman, bring it up and then look, and then no. The mumche can go down and you can go see it in the pit. And then says Rashi, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi ulebi. Right, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that is Rabbi. V'lav hainu Rabbi Yehuda d'manitin. That is not the Rabbi Yehuda of our Mishnah. Distam Rabbi Yehuda u Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli. Whenever the Mishnah says Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, right? That's Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli. That is not Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. That is a different. That is an earlier Tana. Okay, so we said Im yesh bo mum, says Rashi, afilu nafal ba'yom. Even if the mum is from today, even if the mum is from Yom Tov, yalev yishchot. You can bring up the animal and the bechor and you can shecht it. The late lay muktzeh bechor. He does not hold by muktzeh when it comes to a bechor. The im lav. What did the Braita say? Right? Im lav lo yishchot. You cannot do shchita. So says Rashi, explains. He gives two interpretations. Number one, he says like this. The imlav, the aval, the aske. Okay, if you had already gone and taken the animal out without having the mumcha come and check if it has a mum, right? Lo yishchot, afilu nafal bo mum le'achal hala. So if you did this harama, he says, this is first interpretation, what Rabbi Dana is coming to exclude. If you went and the bechor tam, which fell into the pit, you went and took it out, of the pit, even though he doesn't hold by muktzah. What should be the problem? What should be the problem now? You're saying not to do the shechita. So he says, right? I'll read Rashi again. Avava aske. You went and you took it and you lifted it up. Okay, without having a mumche check it first. Lo yishchot afilu nafal bo mum nachala. So even if after you took it out, now it has a mum. Okay, so now it's not actually muktzah. Now you would, under normal circumstances, be allowed to shecht it. Nonetheless, here we say no. Mishum the knasahu. This is a knas. This is a fine. This is a penalty that the Rabbanan imposed. Okay, mishum davav aske, because you went and you transgressed. You went and you went and you took it out when you weren't supposed to do. Okay, we have knasit, rabbinic knasot all throughout Shas. For example, we had not so long ago we had Pesach, right? And everybody knows that chametz shavar leva Pesach you're not allowed to eat or you're not allowed to do anything with, because on Pesach itself, this is why when we go to the supermarkets we should still probably be checking. Big supermarkets you're probably okay, but you go to a small makolet, you should check. They have on the wall the tuda of mechirat chametz. Why? Because if they didn't sell their chametz, if it's chametz that was owned by a Jew on Pesach, it's forbidden to eat it even after Pesach. But even though that's actually a machloket in the Gemara, but we pass like Rabbi Shimon that it is a knas. It's a knas. Rabbanan said you're not allowed to own it on Pesach, and therefore if you did, you're not allowed to benefit from it to eat it after Pesach. But that is a rabbinic knas. Or another example, the Gemara, the Mishnah, in the beginning of Shabbos. If you're familiar, the Mishnah at the beginning of Masechet Shabbat talks about carrying. It talks about you have an ani and a balabayit, one standing inside the house, one standing outside the house, which is Roshut Yachid and Roshut Rabim. And talks about if you stick out your arm and you pass an object from one to the other, that would be a problem of carrying. So the Gemara there has a whole sugya that you're not allowed to take your arm and stick your arm out into Roshut Rabim. And there's a case whereby a person put their arm out and was carrying something in Rishut Rabim, even though they weren't meant to. So there, but I made a knas that said you can't put your hand back inside. Okay, different. It would be a very, very uncomfortable Shabbos. But the different things, different knasot that we find rabbinically throughout Shas. By the way, I'll just mention, if we're mentioning the word knas, when it comes to monetary law, we have that's not what we're talking about now. But when it comes to monetary law, we have a concept of a knas as well, meaning there are certain payments that one has to make, and there are certain payments, additional payments, which you might be charged for, which are called a knas, which is a penalty. Nowadays, because we do not have beit din smuchin, we don't have the ability to impose the knasot that the Torah gave. We have the ability to impose, paying back money that you owe someone, but the additional knas that we are not able to impose nowadays. But anyway, that's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about where there's just an action you have to do, where Rabbanan imposed a penalty. You transgress something, the right of the Rabbanan. Rabbanan said, okay, as a result, you have a knas. So here, they said, you can't go down and take this bechor from the bor on Yom Tov. You need to go, the mumcha needs to go down and check if there's a mum, and only if there's a mum can you go and take it out. So you didn't do that. You took it out, right, when you weren't allowed to. Even though now it has a mum, so now you could actually shecht it, right? So nonetheless, you still can't. That's the knas. That's what Rashi explains. Says, Avav askei lo yishchot, afir nafal bo mum la'achal ha'ala'a, v'knas ha'u, mishum davav askei. Okay, then he says, inami, just, okay, something else I'll add in here, the letter inami. Lo yishchot, lo yale baramat shchita kamar. Okay, or we could read it as follows. When it says, because again, the difficulty here is the fact that it says lo yishchot. It doesn't say lo yale. It says lo yishchot. So he says maybe lo yishchot actually means lo yale baramat shchita. It means the same thing. It means don't lift it up with the harama, right, with the intent of performing shchita. The lo yishchot lo yitztrich, the atamu. Right. This is the question that Rashi is really trying to understand. He says, "Lo yishchot." If we're dealing with a be'ema, which is a bechor, which is tam, meaning there is no mum. Obviously, you can't shecht it. So, what does it mean, lo yishchot? So, one possibility is that lo yishchot means that you took it out when you weren't supposed to, and now, and at that time it was a tam, or at least at that time you thought it was a tam, and now it has a mum, and nonetheless, it's a concept you can't shochet. Or lo yishchot actually means lo yaleh. Don't take it out with a harama in order to have a look and see that there's a mum, and then you'll be able to do the shchita. Right? It says lo yishchot lo yishchot. Now, all this is in the Braita because all this challenge comes because the Braita says b'chol tam shenafal bo. Now he says matnitin de lo shanin anachi. He says we gave a different. That's how we explained the Braita. The Mishnah we explained differently. He says the lo matzinu lo ukma dmaniti lo matzinu lo ukma betam, because the Mishnah we had to explain in a different way. Because the Mishnah we couldn't say it's talking about a bechor tam, mishum de Rabbi Yehuda muktzeit le. Okay, that's why Rashi had to explain to us that here we're dealing with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and in the Mishnah we're dealing with Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai. It's a different Rabbi Yehuda, and he holds by muktzeh. So Rabbi Yehuda holds by muktzeh. So the fact that it was a tam, right, this whole explanation wouldn't work according to him because they have a problem of muktzeh. ולא מטיל המימם יש פה מום שנפל בו ביום טוב יעלה וישחוט. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you couldn't say that if there was a mum that fell on Yom Tov, you could now go into shchita. וכיוון דל כוכך בבעל מום תוקמה, לא יצטרך לשנוי ספר בשנוי דחיקה. And since over there you had to say that you're talking about a בעל mum and not a tam, so then you didn't have to come up with all different explanations for the sefer. ולמימם דלא ישחוט לא יעלה כמה. Right. That's why over here we're explaining. We had the same question before in our Mishnah, if you remember, when it said lo yishchot, and we said why does it say lo yishchot and not lo yalev yishchot? That's what we said at the beginning of the share. Yeah, Rashi is giving me this explanation of that lo yishchot actually means lo yaleh. It's not. That's not what it says. That's not what the words mean. But I'm only saying that because if I'm dealing with a bechor tam, there's no other way to explain it. If I'm dealing with a ba'al mum, so there's a mashvachem. Because over there, says Rashi, the matzeh lishnoye shapir kedeshaninan. There was a much simpler way to explain it. Tashminan v'im lav lo ya kavua mibod yom de'afilu avav askei lo yishchot. In other words, if it didn't have a mum kavua from before, that's how we explain it over there. That it didn't have a mum kavua from Erev Yom Tov, it just had a mum over, and then even if we went and took it up, you can't do the shchita. That was the way we explained the Braita, right? We explained the Braita was talking about where you had a mum over before Yom Tov, and then on Yom Tov you had a mum kavua. Excuse me, that's how we explained the Mishnah. We had to explain the Mishnah that way because it was dealing with a Baal Mum, and we had to explain the Mishnah that way because it was the pin of Rabbi Yehuda who has a problem of muktzeh. Yeah, with not Rabbi Yehuda, here's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in our Braita, right? And it says explicitly that it's a Bechor Tam, so that's why we come with a different explanation. We said either we said Rashi Sova gave two explanations, right? Either we're saying that it's a knas that you took the animal out, right? Even though afterwards it had a mum, or we're saying that lo yishchot actually means lo yaleh. Okay, those are the two explanations according to Rashi's Girsa. Rashi now on the two dots in Rashi now he says lashon acher. There's a third possibility, which is lo garas bibraita bechol tam. Right? There are those who have the braita with a different different girsa, where it doesn't say tam. So if it doesn't say tam, so then it's like our Mishnah, like you might need in Garsinan bibraita, that it's like in our Mishnah. Okay, so that was the first opinion. That was the first opinion in the Braita. Second opinion in the Braita is like this. Back in the Gemara, 3 lines from the bottom, it says Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, Halayamo ein lo inmumim b'yom tov. You're saying, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that you go down and you check the Bechor in the bore if there's got a mum. But we've said that we don't see mumim on Yom Tov. Ketzad, nolad bo mum elev Yom Tov, ein mevaklin oto b'Yom Tov. Nolad bo mum b'Yom Tov, right? Rabbi Shimon Omer, ein ze menemuchan, ושבין שאם נולד הוא ומומו עמו, שזה menemuchan. Okay, Beseda, we'll start. We'll pick it up from there tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll examine that opinion in more detail. All right. Have a good day, everybody. Hopefully a quiet day, peaceful day, no more sirens.
At least until tomorrow. Okay.